During the 3 days of fighting here at the Chickamauga battlefield, nearly 125,000 soldiers from both sides were engaged in some form or fashion here in September of 1863. That means that there are 125,000 individual stories waiting to be uncovered here in the forests and fields of Chickamauga. Now, we will never know every single one of these stories, but it is my goal to uncover as many of these stories as I can, and today we uncover two of those, one Union and one Confederate soldier who fought here in September of 1863, and today we learn about their individual story. So right now we are in the area where the Union would establish their line on their extreme left flank, and manning this area was Brigadier General John King's regular brigade, and his men would move into this area and begin fortifying their position with breastworks. Now, King's brigade was heavily engaged in the area of Jay's Mill, where they suffered some pretty heavy casualties, and now on September 20th of 1863 they are part of the left flank here of the Union Army that is surrounding Kelly Field. And within King's brigade was the 15th U.S. Infantry, and they had about 260 men in reserve about 100 yards behind the main Union line. Now, on the morning of September 20th, the Confederates would renew their attacks, and one of the first attacks to take place on that morning was led by John C. Breckinridge, and his division would sweep through the fields beyond the wood line here and begin pushing back Union forces along the Lafayette Road in John Beatty's brigade in this direction here. And while that was happening, you also had elements of Benjamin Helm's Orphan Brigade assaulting directly at us at this position here. So things were beginning to get a little sketchy here for the Union early on. John Beatty's brigade began breaking, and now that exposed the left flank of John King's regular brigade in this general area. Now, within the 15th U.S. Infantry was a man by the name of William Carson, who was a 23-year-old bugler. And William Carson would put down his bugle and he would grab a gun and take part in the fight here. Now, when John Beatty's brigade began to break, that exposed the flank of John King's brigade, and soldiers from the 16th and 18th and 19th U.S. Infantry began to break and pull back through the woods here and into Kelly Field, which is about 100 yards in this direction here. Now, in seeing this, Carson would throw down his gun, rush 30 yards to the color bearer of the 18th U.S. Infantry, and he would state, "Let us rally these men or the whole left is gone." The color bearer of the 18th U.S. Infantry began to wave his flag, and Carson would begin sounding "Rally on the colors" with his bugle. He would begin passing back and forth in front of the newly formed Union line, and within a few minutes what looked like a Union rout now turned into a complete victory, and this new Union line began pushing back elements of Breckinridge's division. So right now I'm standing in the area of John King's brigade, and we mentioned how Beatty's brigade to our left began pulling back, which now meant Confederate forces are on our flank and beginning to get in behind us near Kelly Field. Men of King's brigade recognized this, and now they began pulling back. So now you had a ripple effect here. Imagine being 23 years old in this fight. You're a bugler, you decided to pick up a gun and help in the fight here, and all of a sudden you see men pulling back, and your first instinct is to run to the color bearer of the 18th U.S. Infantry and begin rallying the remnants of King's brigade when all the officers here could not stop their men from retreating. William Carson began sounding "Rally to the colors," and a new Union line began forming to our rear here, and they began slowly pushing back the Confederates.
"Let us rally these men or the whole left is gone." The brave fellow stopped and waved his flag while I sounded to the colors. The men cheered and rushed back into line. Still sounding the rally, I passed back and forth in front of the forming line, and what a few minutes before seemed like a hopeless and disastrous rout now turned out to be a complete victory. The retreat had been checked and the enemy driven back with awful slaughter. William Carson, 15th U.S. Infantry.
So one of the things I always like showing is some of the symbolism on these monuments that were placed by the veterans. So right here you have the 15th U.S. Infantry, who William Carson was a member of. And you can see the symbolism here, a Union soldier behind some breastworks here. And making my way a little further down the line, you have the 16th U.S. Infantry, and you have another soldier behind some breastworks here. And in this general area, you have the 19th U.S. Infantry. And as you can see again, you have a soldier behind some breastworks here. So it's pretty safe to assume the Union forces in this general area were pretty thankful for these breastworks here. They were able to withstand numerous Confederate attacks here and hold this ground for hours. So now we're looking at the monument to the 2nd Ohio. Now, the 2nd Ohio began breaking as well, and they would begin pulling back towards Kelly Field, which is just through that clearing here. Now, Carson would also see this regiment pulling back. He would head them off, get the regiment to stop, and he would sound rally on the colors on his bugle, and the 2nd Ohio would begin reforming. Unfortunately for the men of the 2nd Ohio, as they were reforming, they were hit with a Confederate volley, and the regiment completely broke. So despite Carson's efforts, he wasn't able to rally every regiment in the area, and when you're trying to reform and then you're hit with a volley and dozens of men are dropped, you can't really blame the men of the 2nd Ohio for deciding not to stick around anymore. But that took place right back here. Now, once there was a lull in the fighting, Carson would discover 10 bullet holes in his uniform, 3 of which had pierced his hat, and he discovered that he was slightly wounded in his left arm. So being a bugler, he obviously made a pretty good target. And once Carson was able to rally the men in King's brigade, these men would hold their position until they were essentially out of ammunition. And a large portion of King's brigade here would be taken prisoner at around 6:30 p.m., including Carson himself.
His acts of heroism on the 20th of September 1863 that came under my personal observation, I believe are without a parallel of individual bravery of that memorable battle. He with his bugle made it possible for us to check a most disastrous retreat. Captain William G. Galloway, 15th U.S. Infantry.
So right now we are currently in the position of Colonel Bernard Laybolt's brigade, and his brigade would be ordered to move up to this location here. Now, directly to our front, you obviously see that wood line. Now behind that wood line would be Brotherton Field and the Brotherton Cabin. Now that is where the Confederates would launch their assault and break through the Union line here. Now, elements of Sheridan's division would be brought up to try and stem the tide here. So we're in the general position of Laybolt's brigade, and to our front would have been a brigade of Alabamians under the command of Zachariah Dees. Now, behind him was a brigade of Mississippians under the command of Patton Anderson. Now, Laybolt would organize his men into a column formation. So you can kind of see these 4 markers here are kind of stacked in a straight line. So Laybolt would receive orders to launch a bayonet charge into the advancing Confederate forces, and despite his reluctance to do this, he obviously carried out these orders. So we're in the position of the 2nd Missouri, so they would form in the back, and they were under the command of Major Arnold Beck. Now, this regiment was raised in St. Louis in the early days of the war, and they were pretty experienced. They saw action at Pea Ridge, Perryville, Stones River, and now they were here at Chickamauga. Now, the interesting thing about the 2nd Missouri is they carried 69 caliber French rifles that used the distinctive sword bayonets, and they were considered one of the best drilled outfits in the Army of the Cumberland. So, to paint the scene here, we're in the position of the 2nd Missouri. Alabamians under the command of Zachariah Dees would break through that wood line, and Laybolt's brigade would charge right into them and suffer some pretty heavy casualties. Now, the brigade behind the Alabamians, like we mentioned, was the Mississippians under the command of Patton Anderson. And within his brigade, you had the 44th Mississippi Infantry, and within that regiment, you had a private by the name of Kemp Higginbotham. Now, Higginbotham and the rest of the 44th Mississippi would advance into this field, moving up towards what would be Lytle Hill. Now, the regiments in Leiboldt's brigade would suffer heavy casualties with this column bayonet attack, and they made really easy targets. The regiments were stacked one right behind the other, so the Confederate infantry can just pour volleys into them. They suffered pretty heavily, and although they slowed the Confederate advance, they began pulling back. And Private Higginbotham would be advancing with the 44th Mississippi, and he would come across 3 Union soldiers from the 2nd Missouri hunkered down behind some battle debris here.
Our regiment was cut to pieces at Chickamauga. At one point, however, we had gained an advantage over the 2nd Missouri. We were in possession of ground from which most of them had been driven. I was wounded in the hand, but not seriously. In looking about, I discovered 3 members of the 2nd Missouri behind a pile of rails. Private Kemp Higginbotham, 44th Mississippi.
So Higginbotham would see 3 Union soldiers hunkered down behind some battle debris, demand their surrender. 2 of the Union soldiers would throw down their weapons, and the 3rd was the 2nd Missouri color bearer. Now, Higginbotham would take these newly captured Union soldiers and bring them to the rear. Higginbotham would begin addressing a minor wound, and while doing so, he began conversing with these Union soldiers, and one of which was the color bearer of the 2nd Missouri, like we touched on. And this color bearer obviously handed over the colors to Higginbotham and politely asked if he could return the 2nd Missouri colors after the war had ended. He told them that this flag was made by the women of St. Louis, and it was given to them upon their mustering in the early days of the war. And Higginbotham agreed, but right after this, an aide to General Longstreet would ride up to this group, and this aide would demand the regimental colors from Higginbotham. Higginbotham was adamant and would not hand over the colors. The aide rode off, and then Higginbotham tucked that flag into his jacket, and then he would mail the flag back home to Mississippi as soon as he could, so the colors were safe.
Shortly afterward, an aide-de-camp of General Longstreet demanded that I surrender the flag to him, but I refused, knowing he was not the proper officer. He attempted to force me to give it up, but with the aid of the prisoners, we retained the flag. Private Kemp Higginbotham, 44th Mississippi.
In the summer of 1891, Higginbotham dug out that old flag and decided it was time for it to go home. Higginbotham placed a notice in a local newspaper called the Globe Democrat. He would then receive a few responses and begin corresponding with William C. Schubert, who was the vice president of the 2nd Missouri Regimental Association. A meeting was arranged and nearly 40 members of the 2nd Missouri would attend the event, some coming from as far away as Wisconsin, Illinois, and Iowa. Thanks to the kindness and integrity of a former enemy, the colors were finally returned home to the St. Louis community.
Now, those were just 2 brief stories in a battle that raged here for 3 days. And one story, William Carson for the 15th U.S. Infantry goes above and beyond the call of duty, and he would be awarded the Medal of Honor well after the Civil War ended. And another story, Private Kemp Higginbotham shows a moment of compassion and understanding while these 2 sides were just trying to kill each other, and he captures 3 Union troops who were no doubt shooting at his regiment and brings them to the rear, and then makes a promise to that soldier and carries out that promise well after the war. It's little stories like that that remind you that these are all just ordinary people. Little moments of compassion and understanding in a sea of hell and chaos is always nice to learn about, and I hope you enjoyed these stories.